The quiet life of Harmony Gulch. The familiar perfume of stale coffee and aged leather imbued Sheriff Brody's small office, a comforting constant on a Tuesday morning. Sunbeams, fractured by the grimy window pane, danced with suspended dust motes. He settled back in his protesting chair, boots propped on the scarred oak desk, and observed Harmony Gulch's quiet awakening. It was always a gradual unfurling. Old Man Hemlock already swept the porch of his general store, his rhythm as dependable as dawn. Mrs. Gable, neat pin curls still in place, meticulously watered the petunias outside the bakery, a ritual never deviated from. Harmony Gulch existed as a town sculpted from quietude. Its main thoroughfare, little more than a dusty track, was lined with wooden storefronts that had seen better decades. The Golden Nugget Saloon, rarely golden and seldom hosting more than a handful of grizzled prospectors nursing tepid beer, offered scant excitement. The blacksmith's hammer chimed sporadically, a gentle pulse against the rustling cottonwood leaves. Crime here was an anomaly, an uninvited specter. A stray dogfight, a pilfered pie from Mrs. Gable's window, or an occasional drunken brawl quelled with Brody's stern gaze and steady hand. These were the grandest disturbances. Brody watched a tumbleweed idly traverse the street, an apt emblem for his own existence. He was the anchor of this somnolent town, its sole guardian, yet often felt like a forgotten relic. His days stretched long and uneventful, filled with overlooked paperwork, unremarked patrols, and a pervasive silence. He ran a hand over his neatly trimmed beard, the rough stubble, a familiar comfort. He was a man of routine, of order, and Harmony Gulch offered these in abundance, perhaps too much. A sigh escaped him, a wisp of air quickly absorbed by the stillness. Nearing 40, his life flowed as a steady, unchanging current. He'd weathered his share of hardship in youth, but Harmony Gulch had become his sanctuary, a place where past shadows struggled to penetrate. He'd embraced the solitude, the predictable cadence, yet there were moments, especially on mornings like these, when the quiet felt less like peace and more like an echo of his own isolation. He envisioned the empty house awaiting him each night, the solitary meals, the books he read by the dim glow of an oil lamp, his only company, the occasional chirp of crickets or the distant lament of a coyote. He wasn't one to crave constant companionship, but a quiet conversation, a shared laugh, even a simple nod of understanding. These were luxuries long absent. He'd cultivated self-sufficiency, relying on his own counsel, but sometimes the weight of it pressed heavily. He pushed off his desk, the chair groaning in protest. Time for morning rounds. Adjusting the brim of his hat, its leather worn smooth by years of handling, he settled his hand on the butt of his revolver, more a symbol than a necessity in Harmony Gulch. Stepping onto the dusty street, the sun warm on his face, he surveyed the familiar storefronts, the distant mountains, the vast, empty sky. Everything mirrored yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. A quiet life, indeed. He wondered, not for the first time, if this stasis was his permanent lot. If anything, or anyone, would ever ripple the placid surface of his existence. He walked with an unhurried, steady gait, his elongated shadow preceding him, a solitary figure in a muted world. The notion of change, of something new, was a distant, almost forgotten dream, like an old melody played on a broken harmonica. He hadn't realized how deeply he yearned for it until now. A stormy arrival. The wind, a boisterous, unseen entity, whipped dust devils across Harmony Gulch's single thoroughfare, rattling the signs above the mercantile and the saloon. Sheriff Brody, a man whose shoulders carried the weight of the town's peace, stood near the hitching post, his gaze fixed on the distant plume of dust that signaled the stagecoach's imminent arrival. A late autumn chill had settled in, promising an early winter, and the sky above was a bruised canvas of purples and grays. He tugged his hat lower, the brim offering little defense against the sharp, biting gusts. Moments later, the distinctive creak and groan of the heavy vehicle grew louder, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of hooves. The stagecoach, mud-splattered and weary from its journey, lumbered to a halt in front of the livery. Its painted sides were dull with travel, and the driver, a burly man named Silas with a perpetually gruff expression, wrestled the reins to a stop. Brody approached, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. "Rough ride, Silas?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against the wind's howl. Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Rougher than a badger in a sack, Sheriff. And I brought you a passenger." He gestured with his chin towards the coach's door, which he then unlatched. From the dim interior, a woman emerged, her movements stiff, almost hesitant. She was slender, draped in a plain, travel-worn gray dress that offered little warmth. A simple shawl was clutched tightly around her shoulders, and her bonnet, while serving its purpose, couldn't entirely conceal the dark strands of hair escaping to frame a face that spoke of quiet endurance. Her eyes, a startling shade of hazel, swept over the desolate street, pausing on Brody with an almost imperceptible flicker of apprehension. She carried a single, worn valise, which seemed to hold all her worldly possessions. Brody felt an unfamiliar tug of curiosity. There was an air about her, a reserved grace beneath the grime of travel, that set her apart from the usual fortune-seekers or homesteaders who passed through Harmony Gulch. He noticed the slight tremble in her hands as she adjusted her grip on the valise. As the woman, Elara Vance, turned to retrieve a small leather-bound satchel from the coach, Silas leaned closer to Brody, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, barely audible above the wind's shriek. "Heard whispers down the line, Sheriff. That one, she's a healer. A good one, they say, but there was trouble. Something about a patient. Disgraced, they called her." He finished with a shake of his head, eyes still on Elara. Brody's gaze sharpened, moving from Silas to Elara, who was now standing fully upright, her back straight, almost defiant. The word disgraced hung in the blustery air, a stark contrast to the quiet dignity she exuded. He saw the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. A healer, disgraced. The information settled in Brody's mind, a small, unsettling seed. Harmony Gulch had no doctor, and illness, when it struck, was often a death sentence. Yet, Silas's warning, however vague, resonated with the town's ingrained distrust of outsiders, especially those with a past. He watched her for a moment longer, a melancholic thoughtfulness etching itself onto his features. This woman, with her quiet strength and rumored shadow, had just arrived, and the storm outside seemed to mirror the unease she brought with her. A cell for safety. Sheriff Brody watched the lamplight flicker across Elara's face as she tended to the boy. Her movements were precise, gentle, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn world outside his office window. He'd told himself it was the boy's welfare that kept him rooted, a sentinel to a fragile life. But the truth, a bitter pill, was that her presence had chased away a silence that had clung to him like dust for years. The thought of sending her away, back to the desolate tracks that had led her here, twisted in his gut. He was a lawman, sworn to uphold order, not to harbor anyone who brought such a peculiar warmth to his cold, empty home. He cleared his throat, the sound a rough interruption to the soft murmurs Elara offered the sleeping child. Elara startled, her head snapping up. Her eyes, the color of damp earth, held a weariness that belied her careful composure. "He's resting," she whispered, her voice a low current. Brody nodded, tugging at the brim of his hat. "Good." He paced a few steps, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. "Look, Elara, you can't stay here in the office indefinitely." He paused, searching for the right words that wouldn't betray the tremor in his own heart. This town, it ain't always friendly to strangers. Especially not to someone with your particular set of skills. He gestured vaguely, encompassing her healing supplies, the quiet dignity she carried. People talk. They're quick to judge. Elara's gaze dropped to her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. A faint flush touched her cheeks, a fleeting shadow of shame. "I understand, Sheriff." Her voice was barely audible. "I'll be on my way as soon as the boy is strong enough." "No." The word burst from him, sharper than he intended. He watched her flinch and instantly regretted his abruptness. "No, that's not what I meant." He rubbed a hand over his jaw, the stubble rasping beneath his palm. "What I mean is, I have a place. A secure place. For your safety." He walked to the back of the office, pushing open a heavy wooden door that led to a short, dimly lit corridor. At the end, 2 iron-barred cells stood silent and stark. Elara followed, her footsteps light. She stopped at the threshold, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the sparse confines. A cot, a small table, a bucket. A prison. Brody gestured towards the cleaner of the 2 cells, the one closest to his office. It's not much, but it's got thick walls, and I'm right here. Nobody's getting in or out without me knowing. It'll keep you safe from prying eyes and from the elements." He didn't mention the other unspoken threat, the one that lingered in the back of his mind, the potential for her to simply vanish into the night, taking with her the fragile hope she'd unwittingly brought. Elara looked from the cell to Brody, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Resignation? Gratitude? He couldn't tell. She moved slowly, deliberately, into the space, her shoulders squared. She ran a hand over the rough blanket on the cot. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice soft but firm. It is safe." Brody watched her, a knot of relief and something else, something akin to trepidation, forming in his chest. He closed the cell door, the clang of the metal a dull echo. He didn't lock it immediately. He wouldn't. Not yet. He watched her settle, her quiet acceptance, a stark contrast to the roaring chaos that usually accompanied such a confinement. He found himself almost smiling. The silence hadn't entirely returned. Whispers and watching eyes. The clatter of the iron door, a final, resonant thud, echoed through the small, stone-walled room. Elara Vance ran a hand over the rough-hewn timber of the cot. A faint, almost imperceptible hum escaping her lips. It was a familiar tune, one her grandmother used to sing while mending torn fishing nets, a melody of quiet resilience. She smoothed the thin, scratchy blanket, aligning it with the cot's edge, then ran a hand over the single, small window, dusting off the fine layer of grit that had settled there. This wasn't home, not by a long shot, but she'd make it orderly at least. Order was a small comfort when everything else felt chaotic. From her vantage point, a sliver of the dusty main street was visible. The afternoon sun, though starting its descent, still beat down fiercely, shimmering off the worn planks of the boardwalk. Elara watched, a pang of something akin to longing tightening her chest, as two children, a boy and a girl, chased a scruffy dog down the street. Their laughter, light and unburdened, drifted on the wind, a stark contrast to the silence of her confinement. The boy, with hair the color of corn silk, tripped, sending the girl into a fit of giggles. He bounced back up, unhurt, and continued their game. Elara's gaze softened, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. She remembered such carefree days, a lifetime ago. Outside, the town of Harmony Creek stirred with its usual afternoon rhythm, but beneath the surface, a new current rippled. Jedediah Miller, his broad shoulders filling the doorway of the general store, watched the sheriff's office with a narrowed gaze. "Brody's got himself a guest," he rumbled to Silas, the store owner, as he picked up a sack of flour. "Heard a woman's cryin' from in there last night." Silas, a scrawny man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, wiped a dusty jar with a rag. "Hi, Jedediah." "A regular mystery she is," rode in with him. "All quiet like. No one saw her face proper." He leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Some say she's a fugitive, runnin' from the law. Others whisper she's a gambler, cheated someone important." Jedediah grunted, hoisting the flour sack onto his shoulder. "Brody ain't one to take in a criminal for a guest. More likely he's got her for safekeeping. Still, a woman in the jailhouse, that ain't right." His eyes, usually fixed on the horizon, flickered to the children playing. He thought of his own little ones, tucked safely at home. He wouldn't want them anywhere near a jail. Sheriff Brody, meanwhile, stood by the window of his office, sipping a lukewarm coffee. He watched the curious glances directed at his building, the hushed conversations on the street. He knew what they were thinking. He knew the questions that hung unspoken in the air. His new guest was an enigma to them, a ripple in the placid waters of Harmony Creek. He saw Jedediah's stern expression, the way his gaze lingered on the jailhouse. Brody felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on him. He had made a choice, and now he had to live with the consequences, and with the whispers of a town trying to piece together a story he wasn't yet ready to tell. He just hoped Elara could endure the watching eyes. A fever takes hold. The insistent rapping on Sheriff Brody's door tore him from a shallow sleep. It wasn't the hesitant knock of a late-night traveler, nor the casual thump of a neighbor. This was a desperate, almost frantic assault on the wood, each strike echoing the urgency of the hour. Brody grabbed his trousers, pulling them on over his nightshirt as he stumbled towards the sound, the cold floorboards biting at his bare feet. He unlatched the door to find Jedediah Miller, usually a pillar of stoic calm, a frantic shadow against the pre-dawn gloom. Jed's face was etched with a raw fear Brody had rarely witnessed. His usually tidy hair was disheveled, and his eyes, wide and bloodshot, fixed on Brody with an almost desperate plea. "Sheriff," Jedediah rasped, his voice hoarse, "it's Lily. She's burning up. Hotter than a blacksmith's forge." He wrung his hands, a gesture so uncharacteristic of the practical, unflappable man that Brody's stomach clenched. "Started yesterday," Just a bit of a chill. But now she ain't making sense, Sheriff. Keeps talking about butterflies in the snow. Brody's mind immediately went to Lily, the bright spark of Harmony Gulch, her laugh like wind chimes. The thought of her small, vibrant form consumed by fever sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the early morning air. "Doc Henderson?" Brody asked, though the question felt hollow even as he spoke it. Jedediah shook his head, a grim, defeated motion. "Gone. Rode out late yesterday for that mining camp up north. Said he'd be back by tomorrow, maybe the next day," said Mrs. Gable's boy took a tumble. Jed's voice broke on the last word, and he visibly swallowed, trying to regain his composure. "My Martha, she's trying everything. Cold rags, willow bark tea, but it ain't doing no good. She just keeps getting worse." Brody felt a familiar dread settle in his chest. Harmony Gulch was a small town, a sturdy one, but its fragility became starkly apparent in moments like these. Without the doctor, they were just a collection of worried souls, armed with old wives' tales and hope. He looked at Jedediah, whose shoulders now seemed to carry the weight of the entire world. The unspoken question hung heavy between them. What could they do? "Let me get dressed, Jedediah," Brody said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll come straight over." He knew it was a hollow promise of aid, a gesture of solidarity more than actual help. He was a sheriff, not a healer, but he couldn't leave Jedediah to face this alone. As he watched Jedediah turn and hurry back into the fading darkness, Brody felt the cold seep deeper, an icy premonition of helplessness. The town was asleep, dreaming its peaceful dreams, unaware of the silent, relentless siege taking hold of one of its most cherished hearts. The distant cry of a coyote seemed to mourn with him. Lily, so full of life, now battling an unseen enemy, and the only person who could truly help was miles away. A healer's heart. The cloying scent of stale air and something metallic, blood perhaps or rust, thickened around Sheriff Brody as he approached the cell. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His gaze, heavy with a silent appeal, found Elara's. In its depths, she saw not just the weariness of a man burdened by duty, but a deeper, more personal worry that tugged at her own conscience. He stood by the bars, a silhouette against the dim light filtering from the small, barred window, his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. Elara's breath hitched. She knew what that look meant, what it always meant, when someone turned to her, with that particular blend of desperation and hope. It was a plea, unvoiced but potent, for the very thing she'd sworn to bury. Her heart, a small, persistent drum in her chest, began to beat a quick, anxious rhythm. The memory of the town council, their faces contorted in righteous fury, flashed behind her eyes. The whispers, the pointed fingers, the shame that had clung to her like a shroud. It was all still so raw. To step back into that role, even here, within these cold stone walls, felt like inviting the world's judgment all over again. But then she remembered the sound from earlier, a small, choked gasp that had carried from the next cell, followed by a fragile cough. A child. A child was suffering. The image of the pale, gaunt face she'd glimpsed through the gaps in the rough-hewn planks of the dividing wall burned itself into her mind. The instinct, dormant for so long, surged through her, a powerful, undeniable current. It wasn't a choice, not truly. It was a compulsion, etched into the very fabric of her being. Her hands, long accustomed to the quiet solace of mending her own broken spirit, twitched with the phantom sensation of herbs and poultices. Brody watched her, his expression a careful blank slate, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of understanding. He wasn't pushing, not with words, but his stillness was its own form of pressure. He knew, Elara realized with a jolt, that she couldn't refuse. Not when a life hung in the balance. The fear of public condemnation, of being dragged back into the harsh light of scrutiny, warred with a primal need to alleviate suffering. The healer within her, long suppressed, clawed its way to the surface, demanding release. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. The words, when they came, felt both defiant and terrifyingly vulnerable. "I can help her, Sheriff, if you'll let me." Brody's jaw, which had been tight, relaxed almost imperceptibly. A profound relief washed over his features, though he quickly masked it. Without a word, he unhooked the heavy ring of keys from his belt. The jingle of metal against metal echoed in the quiet space as he selected the right one. The tumblers groaned in protest as he turned the key, and the heavy iron door swung inward with a creak that seemed to announce a new beginning. The long night. The scent of fever and fear hung heavy in the small room, battling the pungent aroma of crushed herbs Elara was methodically preparing. Lily lay pale and still, her usually bright eyes glazed over, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Elara's brow was furrowed in concentration, her nimble fingers working with a precision born of years, not just practice. She steeped dried feverfew in hot water, the steam rising to fog the window panes, then carefully wrung out a cloth, testing its warmth against her wrist, before laying it gently across Lily's forehead. "There, little one," she murmured, her voice a low, soothing hum. "Just rest." The hours blurred into a timeless vigil. Elara applied poultices of willow bark and yarrow to Lily's chest, coaxing the concoction down the child's throat with a carved wooden spoon. Her movements were economical, every action deliberate. When Lily stirred, whimpering softly, Elara began to sing. Her voice, rarely heard beyond the confines of the jail cell, was surprisingly sweet, a lullaby woven from old folk tunes and forgotten melodies. It spoke of sun-drenched meadows and the gentle sway of tall grasses, a world far removed from the shadowed room and the child's labored breathing. Lily's small hand found Elara's, gripping it with surprising strength, a silent plea. Outside, the night stretched long and cold. A cluster of townsfolk had gathered near the Miller cabin, their lanterns casting dancing shadows against the rough-hewn walls. Jedediah stood apart, a sentinel of silent grief, his gaze fixed on the single lamp-lit window that marked his daughter's room. His knuckles were white, where he gripped the rough wood of the porch railing. Sheriff Brody, his hat pulled low, watched Jedediah with a quiet empathy, occasionally glancing towards the cabin, a silent prayer forming on his lips. The air thrummed with unspoken anxiety. Whispers circulated, hushed and respectful, about the jailbird healer inside. Skepticism, once sharp and vocal, had dulled to a low murmur of desperate hope. They had seen Lily's decline, witnessed Jedediah's helpless despair. Now a stranger, a woman burdened by her past, was their only chance. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in hues of bruised purple and rose, a soft, sustained cough echoed from within the cabin. Jedediah flinched, his head snapping towards the sound. Moments later, the cough came again, weaker this time, followed by a long, shuddering breath. The silence that followed felt impossibly vast. Then, Elara's voice, clear and steady, carried through the thin walls. "She's sleeping now, Jedediah. The fever has broken." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered townsfolk. Jedediah pushed himself from the railing, his legs momentarily unsteady. Sheriff Brody offered a small, weary smile, the first true relief he'd felt in days. The long night was finally over. The jailbird healer had, against all expectations, brought them hope. Dawn of hope. The first hint of morning stretched a pale gray across the dusty cell window, chasing away the oppressive shadows of a long, anxious night. Elara, hunched over Lily's cot, felt the faintest shift in the girl's breathing, a smoother, less ragged rhythm. Her own eyes, gritty from lack of sleep, focused on the small, flushed face. The fever had been a relentless fire, threatening to consume the child. Elara had spent hours with cool compresses, a steady, soothing presence, her gaze rarely leaving Lily. Suddenly, a flicker beneath the girl's eyelids. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lily's lashes lifted. Wide, blue eyes, still a little clouded, but no longer glazed with fever, met Elara's. A weak, trembling smile touched Lily's lips. It was a fragile, miraculous thing, like the first bloom after a harsh winter. "Mama?" Lily whispered, her voice a reedy thread. Jedediah, who had been slumped against the wall, head buried in his hands, shot upright as if struck. His wife, who had been weeping silently beside him for what felt like an eternity, gasped, a choked sob escaping her. They rushed to the cot, their faces a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming hope. "Lily Bug," Jedediah's voice, usually a low rumble, cracked. He knelt, his large, calloused hand gently stroking his daughter's brow. The heat was gone. A wave of profound relief washed over him, leaving him weak in its wake. Tears, hot and unashamed, streamed down his weathered cheeks. Lily's mother scooped the child into her arms, murmuring prayers and endearments. Her eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, found Elara's. "Thank you," she choked out, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, Elara, thank you. You saved her. You truly saved our girl." Jedediah, still trembling, stood and faced Elara. The gruffness that usually armored him had vanished, replaced by an raw vulnerability. He reached out, taking Elara's hand in both of his. His grip was firm yet gentle, conveying a depth of gratitude words couldn't fully capture. We owe you everything," he said, his voice husky. Everything. The wary distrust that had etched itself onto his features since Elara's arrival had been completely erased, replaced by an earnest, heartfelt respect. Sheriff Brody, who had kept vigil by the cell door, a silent sentinel throughout the night, stepped forward. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a rare sight. The burden he'd carried, the worry for Lily, and the unspoken fear of Elara's potential failure, lifted visibly from his shoulders. He nodded, a deep, meaningful gesture. As the news spread with the rising sun, a small crowd began to gather outside the jailhouse. Whispers had turned to relieved murmurs, then to outright expressions of awe. When Lily, weak but undeniably alive, was carried out by her father, a collective sigh swept through the townspeople. Their gazes, once filled with suspicion and judgment, now turned to Elara with a profound shift. The wary looks were replaced by expressions of admiration and gratitude. Mrs. Henderson, who had been among the loudest voices against Elara, clutched her apron to her chest, her eyes wide with a newfound understanding. Young Billy, who'd snickered at the jail healer, now looked at Elara with open curiosity and respect. The air, heavy with mistrust just hours before, now thrummed with a quiet reverence. Elara, still in her simple dress, her face smudged with fatigue, met their gazes with a calm dignity. The shame she carried, a dark weight, felt a fraction lighter. The dawn had indeed brought hope. Not just for Lily, but for Elara, too. Harmony found. The scent of pine smoke and brewing chamomile tea hung sweet in the crisp morning air as Sheriff Brody watched Elara from the porch of his office. She was kneeling beside Lily Miller, who was bundled on a makeshift cot in front of Jed's mercantile, her small frame racked with a persistent cough. Elara's fingers, nimble and gentle, pressed against Lily's forehead, her brow furrowed in concentration. The worried lines on Jed's face, usually set in granite, softened infinitesimally as Elara murmured reassurances, her voice a low, melodic hum. Brody had seen Elara's hands do many things in the months since she'd arrived, tending wounds, mixing salves, even coaxing a smile from Old Man Higgins, who hadn't cracked one in years. But it was the way she looked at Lily, with such profound empathy, that truly held his gaze. There was no judgment, no fear, only a deep well of compassion. The shadow of her past, the rumors that had initially clung to her like a shroud, seemed to dissipate under the midday sun, replaced by the genuine warmth she exuded. He felt a familiar knot in his chest loosen, a loneliness he hadn't realized was so pervasive beginning to unravel. Elara felt the subtle shift in Lily's fever, a faint dampness on her skin, a less strained rhythm to her breathing. She shared a quiet smile with Jed, who let out a slow, relieved breath. "She's turning a corner," Elara whispered, her voice husky. Lily, pale but with a spark returning to her eyes, managed a weak grin. "Thank you, Elara," she rasped, reaching out a tiny hand. Elara gently squeezed it, a profound sense of rightness settling over her. The shame that had once been a constant, heavy cloak now felt distant, almost forgotten. Here, in Harmony Gulch, she was simply Elara, the healer. Her hands, once instruments of a different life, were now dedicated to mending. As the days warmed into spring, so too did the spirit of Harmony Gulch. Lily's recovery was complete, and her laughter, a bell-like sound, echoed through the streets. Elara was at the heart of it all. She'd transformed the dusty corner of Jed's mercantile into a small apothecary, filled with dried herbs and the comforting aroma of various tinctures. She taught the women about poultices, shared stories with the children by the creek, and even managed to convince Jed to plant a small garden of medicinal herbs behind his store. Evenings found her by the communal fire, sharing anecdotes of her travels, her quiet wit drawing chuckles and broad smiles from the townsfolk. Brody would often find himself lingering nearby, a silent sentinel, listening to her voice, watching the way the firelight danced in her eyes. The quiet ache that had resided in his chest for so long, the constant companion of his solitary life, was gone, replaced by a lightness, a sense of belonging he hadn't known he craved. He'd catch her glance across the flames sometimes, a knowing look passing between them, a silent acknowledgment of the sanctuary they had both found in this small, vibrant town. Harmony Gulch, once just a name, now truly lived up to it, woven together by the threads of shared purpose and rediscovered trust. Elara, the healer with a forgotten past, had not only mended bodies but had, in her quiet way, healed the very soul of the town, and in doing so, had healed his own.